So today we're gonna talk about one simple concept that once you master it, it'll improve practically everything you cook. So stick around. So when you make a meal from scratch, think about the process that you use. You probably consider how much salt you put in, the different seasonings and spices you use, obviously how you're gonna cook that dish. But there's one factor that most people don't really pay enough attention to, and that is the acid. Now obviously when we're talking about acid, we're talking about anything that gives you that sour, zingy sensation on your tongue when you eat it. And if you didn't know, acid is actually what makes your mouth water too when you eat or think about certain foods. So it's far more important than most people give it credit for. So today we're gonna talk about some of my favorite sources of acid and how I use them in my dishes. And you're gonna learn how to intuitively use acid in any of the dishes you make, even without a recipe. So let's get into it. So when you think about acid, the most obvious examples that come to your head are probably a vinaigrette dressing or salsa with lime, maybe a spritz of lemon on top of your fish or chicken, but there's far more uses than just those simple examples. A lot of times it is obvious what sources of acid you need to use, but sometimes you need to be a little bit more creative. One of the major places that acid comes in handy is in fattier dishes, because it really just helps to cut through that fat and give your palate a break from all that richness. And a perfect example of this is a cranberry sauce in a Thanksgiving dinner. And this is why I love it so much. So if you haven't seen my cranberry sauce video, make sure to check that out after you watch this one. I'll link it below. But when you think about your Thanksgiving dinner, you're usually looking at turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing. There's not a lot of variety there. I mean, they taste good, but they're missing something. And so that's why the cranberry sauce is so important, to just cut through everything. And it really helps to just balance the whole dish, so all the flavors aren't just blending together. But aside from just adding a sauce on top of an already fatty dish, there's a lot of other uses for acid. Really, every dish you cook should have some form of acid in one way or another. So think about every time you cook a dish, what the source of acid in that dish is, and think about trying to balance it with all the flavors, making sure to taste as you go and adjust as necessary. That's why you always see chefs tasting their dishes, because it's super important. How else are you gonna know if your dish is balanced properly if you don't taste it? Not only for the salt, but for the acid. How many times can I say acid in this video? Someone feel free to count it up and leave it in the comments below. I feel like I'm saying it a lot. So I'll just run through a few practical examples here. I mean, if you go through my old videos, you can see pretty much the sources of acid that I use in every single dish. But for some examples that you haven't seen yet, I'm sure a lot of you like to make stir fries. That's a pretty easy dish to make. But if you really wanna take it to the next level, just throw a couple little dashes of some rice wine vinegar, or even just white wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, whatever you have on hand. It's not gonna make a huge difference, but just throw a few little dabs of that vinegar in there and you'll really just see how it pops out at you in a way that it never would without that additional acid. Or you could even just squeeze some lime juice on it. Really, whatever you have, don't feel like you need to use one or two specific ingredients. This is all about being able to cook without a recipe and just with what you have on hand. So to give you another example, let's talk about a little bit less obvious one, smoothies. You think about fruit and smoothies, you think about the sweetness of it, but you don't really think about balancing the acid. For me, I like to make smoothies with milk.
I like milk.
I usually just use milk and then frozen fruit. Because of that, I found that adding a lime makes a huge difference in your smoothie. Seriously, give it a try. Once you add that lime, or even some other form of acid, anything that adds a little bit of zing to your smoothie, it's really gonna make a huge difference. It's just gonna pop out on your palate like in a way that you could never get with just using the fruit itself. If you want just a more subtle effect, you can just add a little bit of yogurt. But for me, I like my things really sour and acidic, so I like to add the juice from an entire lime or a lemon if that complements the flavors of your smoothie better. But seriously, give that one a try. It's gonna change your life. Anyways, next example, meatballs. You might not think about acid in meatballs either, but think about it. You're adding a Parmesan or Pecorino Romano cheese, as I'm doing here, and it's gonna add not only a little bit of saltiness, but also some nice acidity that's really gonna just make those meatballs pop a little bit more. So that sort of brings me to my next point, because you might be thinking, you know, cheese, I don't really think of cheese as acidic, but it is. I mean, especially a sharper cheese like Parmesan or Pecorino Romano or cheddar, it is going to have a good bit of zing and acidity to it, in addition to the saltiness. So it's really helpful to start thinking about different ingredients, not only in terms of the flavor profile, but the additional elements that they bring to your dish. In terms of the saltiness, acidity, fat, umami, all the basic flavors that you can taste. So cheese is like a super versatile ingredient because it pretty much has all of those factors to it. But I mean, mean, there's a lot of other examples out there. You know, obviously you have vinegar, you have all types of citrus juice, tomatoes, anything that's got a brine to it, so pickles, capers, olives. Pretty much as a rule of thumb, anything fermented is going to have some acidity to it. So wine, beer, fermented fruit, if that's the sort of thing that you're into. Here I've got some blueberries that I'm fermenting, which basically is gonna transform these to a more kind of pungent, acidic type of fruit. You can pretty much ferment anything, so you can really get some super interesting flavors, not only with the acidity, it just adds so much more depth to your ingredients, and you can use them in so many different ways that you wouldn't have really ever thought of in their original form. My point is, anything fermented is going to have a little bit of acidity to it, and it's gonna be something great that you can add to a dish that needs a little bit of acidity. But probably my favorite fermented acidic ingredient would be wine. I use it all the time just to either make a pan sauce or adding it to a tomato sauce or a chili or a pot roast. Wine is a super versatile ingredient and a great source of acid. There's so many sources of acid out there, and that may seem a little bit intimidating, but there are ways to narrow down the options and kind of get a feel for what might complement the particular dish that you're making. And it really comes down to the cuisine that that food falls into and what the traditionally used acidic ingredients in that cuisine are. So if you're making anything Mexican, you can't really go wrong with limes. If you're making Italian cuisine, you're probably looking more at lemons or tomatoes, Parmesan cheese, things like that. You know, if you're making an Asian dish, you're probably looking more at rice vinegar or any other sort of vinegar. So just kind of try to become familiar with the sources of acid that go well with the types of cuisine that you like to make, and just make it a habit to keep those on hand. And if you're like me, where you don't really stick to one cuisine, you make all sorts of dishes, I would just make it a habit to keep pretty much every type of vinegar that you'd ever use on hand. So basically I've got some white wine vinegar, some red wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, seasoned rice wine vinegar, and some Chinese black vinegar. And I almost forgot about the balsamic vinegar. It's got a pretty distinct flavor profile compared to most of these other ones. I would say at the minimum, at least have a white wine vinegar, balsamic vinegar, and probably some sort of black vinegar. I mean, I don't use this one that much, but it does come in handy for specific dishes. So if you keep those on hand, you'll pretty much have your bases covered. And then the other thing I do is when I go to the grocery store, I always buy some lemons and limes, because there's really not that many dishes that squeezing a little bit of lemon or lime isn't going to improve. Plus, they last a while in your fridge, so they're pretty much an essential thing to keep on hand at all times. And then obviously you want to keep maybe a couple different types of cheeses. Keeping tomatoes on hand is a good idea. Definitely some yogurt is good to keep. And then wine, beer, things like that you can deglaze your pans with, add it to sauces or braises. But ultimately it comes down to the dishes that you make and what you find yourself using the most. So feel free to experiment, because that's what cooking is all about. And if you make something and it doesn't taste good, that's fine. The quickest way to learn is just to try things out, letting taste be your guide, and see what works the best. Ultimately, you're the only one who can decide what you like. So next time you make a dish or you're at a restaurant and you order a dish, try to think about the sources of acid that are used in that dish and how they benefit it. And I think you'll learn a lot by doing that. So I hope this video helped you out. If so, I appreciate you hitting the like button, and feel free to check out some of these videos on screen to test out what you learned. I'll see you all in the next one.